Hello and welcome to TI Now's 5G series and today's discussion of evolving network infrastructure towards 5G. To help us understand the latest in this trend are Danielle Jones-Williams, Director of Product Marketing at Juniper Networks, and Peter Jarek, Chief Analyst with Global Data Research. Gentlemen, both, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Absolutely.
I read in a recent report by Market Report Center that between 2019 and 2025, there will be an average annual growth rate in investment in 5G network infrastructure of 70%, 70%, which, if you read the data, is an aggregated number, but a massive growth rate. But I want to start, Peter, with you perhaps, and just tell us the current state of the network today and the infrastructure for this current world.
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the infrastructure and particularly around looking at 5G, and let's put the RAN aside for now and think about the core, but even if we include the RAN, I mean, the state of the infrastructure is, I think, purpose-built is probably the right way to think about it, right? And when I say even if we think about the RAN, whether it's the RAN or the core, you pretty much have purpose-built functions, right? And we're moving towards NFV, but we're moving in that direction. The RAN has maybe been multi-purpose, right? You've got solutions which can hit 3G and 4G, but still built for that type of purpose. And going forward, we may have a little more flexibility, but it's really been sort of a purpose-built solution. And then because the needs, let's say again, we're talking about wireless here, have been limited, the backhaul has been defined by what those architectures look like, right? So whether it's the capacity it's needed, whether it's the architectures which have been more macro-based, it's really all been much more purpose-built towards what we've been looking to do with, let's say, 3G and then 4G more recently.
And so when you think about 5G, and I mean, is it fundamentally different than 4G? And just broadly, how so?
Sure, and that's why I think going back to that, I think about that purpose-built question from the idea of you called out that massive number. And the reason why there's a massive number is that when we're looking at this shift, it's not simply like we can say, well, 5G is just sort of an incremental change, right? It's an incremental change. We're going to do a few things different. The network has been flexible enough that we don't have to do too much to accommodate it. No, we've had this network that was built to serve a few needs. Going forward, 5G being this big shift, that's where you get that huge number, right? So when we look at 5G being fundamentally different, it is and it isn't in some ways. Right, so it's fundamentally different in that there'll be a new air interface, right? At the radio level, we know that's going to be the case. It's going to have to talk about new spectrum bands. Great, that's going to be fundamentally different. But a lot of the other things that 5G is talking about, the use cases like ultra broadband, right? We're seeing some of those things with 4G and with LTE right now. Gigabit LTE, we heard a lot about it, most recently over the last year. Massive IoT, right? We're seeing that with LTE and NB-IoT, Cat-M, right? You think about mission critical communications. We're seeing the latency being driven down on LTE. We're seeing public safety applications. So some of the use cases we're seeing played around with right now, but they're just being introduced. So it is a change from what we've had to date.
Danielle, when you think of the level of uncertainty around the definition of 5G and the technologies to be brought to bear, can you talk a bit about, are there specific requirements that we're trying to meet in a 5G network environment?
Yeah, so let me just give you a little perspective, because when we started to get a better understanding, when we kind of sourced some of our different providers, and we asked them this question, and we get back an RFP that is 150 pages, that indicates to us that they don't really know necessarily the exact requirements that they need. They have a very broad ballpark what they need, but they're really trying to think holistically. But there are some things that we absolutely know based on some of the big thinking ideas around what 5G is going to enable in some of the use cases. We know that latency is going to be a far more critical item that we're going to need to basically engineer for. We don't know, not all applications are going to need a specific latency requirement, but we're going to need to understand what that looks like and be adaptable for things like that. I don't imagine that we're going to have a bandwidth issue per se. I mean, we have 400, 600 gigs of optical capacity coming. Our routers are getting to terabit types of speeds. I think we're going to have that aspect of things kind of covered. But how do you engineer that network to deal with kind of all these micro flows in the network? That's a new engineering effort that needs to happen. And so those are some of the requirements that we definitely see hitting the network. That's, hey, part of this core part of is going to change. That's going to be far more fungible. It's going to be more virtualized. How do those two worlds come together? One of the things that we are thinking about in terms of these new requirements is how we take IP and IT and put them onto the same plane. Right now, if you look at what we need to do to really transform the 5G infrastructure from an IT perspective, IP is not there. We need to get that to be more agile.
When you think, Danielle, of the transforming to a 5G network, are there some elements of the network that we would expect to innovate sooner than other aspects of the network?
Yeah, so let me give you two kind of perspectives that we're thinking about in terms of the network being innovations there. One is, like Peter mentioned, the movement to NFV. And that's definitely taught us a lot. And so the working with open communities, looking at SDN controllers, how do I take either bare metal or VMs? There's this whole notion of cloud native and starting to make things more micro. And we've heard conversations over the past couple of weeks around like thinking that way. So we need to have an SDN infrastructure that can accommodate all that stuff. And a lot of that's grown from the data center realm. And we're just bringing that towards closer to the user. There's initiatives of transforming the whole central office into a data center. So we need to be able to take the networking that happens in that infrastructure and start to mirror it with the networking that happens in the WAN. And so that's where a lot of the automation, our innovation kind of comes into play. How do you stitch together these services in a very secure way to the networking inside of that data center? Automation, telemetry, some of these things are some of the foundation elements that we're innovating so that now we can start to take advantage of more event-based collaboration between that IP network and the IT stuff, the WAN, and within that virtual infrastructure, the data center, micro data center, there's many different terms, but yeah, that's where we're innovating at.
Peter, when you think about requirements that we don't yet fully understand for a 5G network, we sense them, they're out there, and for both of you actually, but tell us a little bit about how are we going to deal with requirements that are not yet defined?
So, and I think it's a great question because a lot of what we hear people when they talk about 5G, right? And it goes back to the question you asked earlier about definitions around 5G, right? We can define it however we want, and carriers are going to end up doing that, right? We already have some carriers talking about 5G evolutions, right? And they've already launched 5G evolutions despite the fact that 5G standard and air interface standard isn't fully defined, right? So people will define that. But more than anything, I think, from a holistic standpoint, we hear is 5G as a platform. Right, a platform to support new use cases, support new audiences, really deliver new services. And it's tough to some extent. It always feels a bit like cheating, right? But it's this idea that we want to develop this platform for all the stuff that we haven't even thought of, right? You know, it's all these, and I think like we learned that lesson from the internet days. And what's the killer app going to be? And no one knows what the killer app is, and so it's kind of punting, right? It's punting. We don't know what the killer app is, right? It's someone's going to develop it. We just want to build this platform, right? But when you talk about building that platform, that assumes that you have to have that flexibility. You have to have a network. You have to have the platform that's flexible enough to support whatever comes next, right? Whatever the next Snapchat or Uber or whatever it is. And so the only real way to do that is to build it as an open platform with enough flexibility inherent in it, whether that's in terms of what the air interface can do, supporting multiple different frequency bands, multiple different sets of, licensed or unlicensed, small cells and macro cells, all that sort of stuff. And then in the core, being software based enough so that whatever the functions are that we need to integrate, and quick enough, right? So not just that we're building some sort of virtual set of functions that, well, over time we can change, but that we can in an agile way introduce these new functions. It's really just being flexible enough in the way we've architected the network that we can support all this. And then architecture also means not just the functions and not just the interface, but the architecture of the way it's being built, right? So that we can have edge clouds if we need low latency, or we can have more stuff in the core if it makes more sense that we need extra processing power deep in the core. Really having that ultimate level of flexibility in terms of the functions and the architecture. And that's really the only way that we're going to be able to solve those things that we don't know what they are that's coming.
Danielle, when you think about some of the innovation for 5G, like security and automation, talk to us a bit about how that is part of the pie.
Yeah, absolutely. We definitely see that, especially around, so security has been very top of mind. We can list off all the different fear-mongering episodes that happened. One that comes to mind that was an IoT attack, which was DNS, the DNS serving company that does a lot of DNS registration, and they got taken down by an IoT. So we know that there's this huge movement towards IoT, which is going to be definitely an enabler and use case, but the folks who are doing these things are not necessarily taking security wholeheartedly to serious. So one of the things that we believe in is that one of the most pervasive assets to deal with security is the network. And so let's use that network as an enforcement entity, and there's elements of how we wanted to enable that enforcement, but use that holistically to do that. There are some lessons that we've learned from cloud. So not all of the aspects of security need to be tightly coupled. We need to disaggregate some of those things. Some of those things need to live. And how do we deal with threats and where they're coming from and be able to push those down in a very automated, the whole notion of SDN, we no longer as human beings can react to these threats. And so we need to have a very automated way of doing that. So we have looked at the network as holistically blending that in. So we have this notion of automation to take care of and react to things in a far faster time and be able to detect a threat no matter where it comes from, have that come to a centralized place, and then be able to, from the cloud, start to push these things out and remediate those threats. And so 5G is going to be no different than that, because the big ideas thinking of 5G is going to have more things, more applications hit the network than ever before. I had a conversation with a individual at the EBC, and he asked me this similar question, and I was like, well, the fact that you don't know what's going to come, and that today you as an IP architect have to go through and 6 to 12 months to think about re-engineering the network to deal with something new, you no longer can behave in that notion. So today, you can start to embrace this notion of automation. You can transform your culture. What are the workflows you're doing today to address, hey, how do you test networks? How do you look at deploying and provisioning networks? Today, you're using an NMS point and click type of environment. Folks like Google and Facebook have taught us that, yeah, you need to actually have APIs and abstract that stuff so that no matter what comes at you, you can maybe program that away, or develop a new API, or use some different languages to address that stuff. Make you more agile so that when you do get hard problems, you can spend some time on it, but no longer be boggled down by the small things, if that makes sense.
My next question, sort of the exit question, was going to be about tangible results of the new network. And you've answered a lot of that right there, which is great. But I would ask both of you, think about it from the enterprise perspective and the consumer perspective about the 5G enabled network. Can you give us a couple of either use cases or examples of how we, as either business consumers or consumers overall, would benefit from this 5G enabled network? Peter, maybe I'll start with you.
Yeah, I think, so let me start with thinking about another sort of constituency, right? The other constituency I think I would think about would be the service providers, right? So the service providers themselves, and what are they going to get out of this? Because I think Daniel hit something really, really important there, right? He talked a bit about what we're doing in the networks today, right? And how you think about your networks. So I think 5G for service providers is a great opportunity to rethink the way they're building these networks, right? We're supposed to see that with 4G, right? LTE was supposed to be, how do we rethink the networks? How do we do new things? How are we not just doing more data, right? It's just a fatter pipe, right? And so I think 5G it's one of those breaking points where people can think, what can I do differently, right? And to some extent, they're going to have to, right? Because the automation question also comes down to this: how do we afford to do all this, right? How do we afford to build this network that's going to have edge clouds and still use, my data centers, and maybe there's some public cloud that's mixed in, and then we've got all these IoT endpoints and small cells and whatever. And so you can't get there until you do automation, right? Automation is going to be key to that. So is security, make it all working together. 5G, I think, is a great breaking point to say, okay, this is all coming. It's going to help your current network as well. We may not get to a full 5G deployment for several years, but this will help your current LTE network. So I think for operators, it's a great opportunity. Beyond that, for consumers, for enterprises, I think on the consumer side of things, there'll be more IoT, there'll be AR and VR with the ultra broadband sort of stuff. Low latency will help with things like automated driving and V2X applications. I think the real change there, that's all incremental, and we're sort of used to that. I think the real big opportunity is on the enterprise and allowing sort of this to be a platform that can support digital industries, right? So how do we integrate mobility? How do we integrate wireless into more industries, whether it's healthcare or transportation or utilities or you name it, right? Smart cities, but really setting up a network that can meet their needs. And again, we can be doing that with LTE, but with the whole concept of network slicing, being how do we have one network that can support the needs of multiple different users, and ultimately how do we allow them to sort of self-provision, right? To have that enterprise go, I need a network slice that can deliver the following latency, right? And you're saying, we don't know what the requirements are, but we know some of them, right? Yeah. How can that enterprise go, give me a network slice that has these characteristics? That opens up all sorts of new opportunities for enterprises, and we're not going to be there tomorrow, right? It's going to take a while. It's a vision, right? But that, I think, is a much bigger change than the consumer side of things, which is just a trajectory that I think we all understand.
Yeah, I would piggyback off of that. And the one thing that I'll latch onto that Peter indicated was the whole customer experience for the enterprise will change. 5G is a forcing function to try to enable that for the enterprises. The thing that I like the most about that is that now you may not even know what a slice is, but you definitely may know that here's some of the things that I know I have to deal with as a IT manager that is coming from some developer who has this crazy idea. How do I deal with that? Well, now I have an opportunity to test those things out in a far faster fashion. Is it working for me? One of the things in that experience that you can go into a web portal that's going to change for the service provider is now that the service provider has all this data coming from these different sources. Now they can also offer up some insights to you as an enterprise. Hey, have you thought about potentially having a different type of service that could be, instead of just a slice of the network, it could be, hey, maybe it's an optical element because you do need a super zero jittery type of application. You might have even thought of some of those questions. So now the service provider's relationship with these enterprises is going to drastically change. And this is going to be a definite kind of enabler of having that. To me, that's the whole notion of, once again, Peter, thank you for introducing this concept of platform. But that is the whole notion of why we think about platform first, generate platform economies, having ecosystems. This changes the fundamental game of how a service provider should think about their business. It is no longer walking in and trying to, as an enterprise, like, I'm just going to give you some piping, or you need some more intelligent piping, or I'm going to start to give you more software-defined piping. All those things are nice, but it doesn't change the fundamental interaction with the customers. This is going to change that fundamental interaction with the customer. That's the one thing that's really got me excited, and that's kind of look forward to coming down the pipe.
Gentlemen, this has been a really meaty and productive episode of the 5G series for TI Now. I thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
We appreciate it.